Okay guys, now that we have our components made and we're ready to install them in our Automata box, let's get our Automata open and we're going to add those components right to our assembly. So I'm going to start out by doing the axle and the axle cap first. So let's drag them in, and I want to get them off of the actual components, off the actual box, and let's go ahead and place them. So now what I'm going to try and do is get this axle right through my axle hole. Ultimately, we want that axle to rotate inside of that hole so that the cams that are attached to the axle will turn with the axle. So we need to do a different type of joint than what we've been doing so far. So let's go ahead and choose joint from our assemble tab, and let's look at the different types of joints that we have. Obviously, we don't want a rigid joint because we want things to move. We said we want the axle to rotate, so the best or most appropriate type of joint is going to be a revolute joint. So I'm going to choose the revolute joint, and I am going to choose the, go back to position, I'm going to choose the end of my axle and then the hole in my Automata, and I want to choose it, the flat disc hole, and go ahead and click OK, and I'll scroll out a little bit. You can see that the axle moved, and there if I animate it, if you look here on the texture, the pattern that I have, you can see that it's rotating, and you can also see the degree spinning right here. Now I do want my axle to be sticking out of that hole a little bit so that I can put a axle stop on it. So I can drag it out a little bit to figure out which dimension I need to change, or in this case I know it's the Z offset, and I do actually want to have an offset of 0.3. That means it'll be sticking out of the surface of the Automata box by 0.3 inches. That's enough for me to stick on the stop cap and still have a little bit of motion space in there. So let's go ahead and apply that revolute joint, and I'm going to undo this and redo it so you guys can see it one more time. So it is joint, choose the motion of revolute, select the end of your axle, so it should look like this when you select it. Okay, and then we're going to go over to our axle hole and again select it so it looks like that. It'll pop it in. We want an offset of 0.30 or a negative 0.30. Play with it until you get the right direction and go ahead and hit OK. So there we have our axle in place just the way we want it. Now we're going to put the axle cap on, or the axle stop, so that the axle won't fall out of our Automata. And that one, again, we're going to go with joint. In this case, we're going to do a rigid joint because we want that axle cap or the axle stop to be attached to the end of our axle. So again, choose the rigid, go back to position. We're going to choose the end of our axle stop to the end of our axle. It will move, and hit OK. And now to test to make sure that we've done that right and everything's working, on our revolute joint, we can right click and we can do animate model, and you can see that the axle is turning and the axle cap is turning with it as it should. Alrighty, so that's the axle and the axle cap. Now let's spin this baby around, and now what we need to do is bring in our handle and our handle peg. So again, just drag them in. I am going to move them kind of over here out of the way a little bit so I can see what's going on. And we're going to be using, again, the rigid command to join these guys up, just like it did on the axle cap. So I'll make sure I'm on rigid, which I am. I am going to choose the opening of my handle to the end of my axle and hit OK. And then I do want to point something out. Because of the length that we made our axle, our handle is flush up against our side. I want to change my handle length just a little bit. So, or excuse me, my axle length just a little bit. So I'm going to go over here to my browser bar, and I'm going to click on the little pencil icon next to my axle to allow me to edit my axle in place. And that's what it's called, editing it in place. I'm not leaving and going to the part to make the changes. I'm going to do it right here. And this is a simple change in the length. So I'm going to make it, let's make it 5.1, and that'll give me the extra 0.05 on either end that I'm adding in. So I'm just changing that length a little bit. Hit the green check up here to finish my ending the edit in place. And now my axle length has been changed ever so slightly. Okay. Now the last thing I need to do is I need to put this handle into this hole. But I want this back edge of the handle flush with the other side of this hole. And I can't see it right now. So I'm going to show you guys how to make parts of your assembly not visible. For assembly purposes, it's nice because you're able to turn things off when they're in your way visually and turn them back on, but they're still there. So all I have to do is I want the top and I want the right side to be invisible to me. I'm just going to choose the little eyeball on the browser bar that's next to those parts, and it will just temporarily make them invisible. They're still there, they still exist in the assembly, they're just not visible, so they're out of our way, which is very nice. And now when I do my rigid constraint, the end of my handle peg to the hole in my handle, and I apply it, I can see the back of my handle to know that I've done that correctly. I come back and I can turn the visibility back on those two side parts. And you can see the little gap that I added, that extra 0.1 in the distance of my angle, or my axle has given me this little space here, and I have that little space right there. Because you actually don't want these two parts rubbing up against each other. It won't work well. Now I can see how my entire automata works. So when I animate my model, you can see that the handle is turning, the axle is turning, and the axle stop is turning. So I've made quite a lot of progress today. Hit the escape key to turn that off, and save your work. Remember, save and save often.